binding on my raw edge quilt. So I have to take pieces of fabric, cut them into 3.5-inch strips. Then I have to take those strips, fold them in half and press them. And once I've pressed them, I join them into a really long strip by sewing them together at 45-degree angles, cutting off the excess, then pinning them. First on, I'm going to pin the raw edges down to the front, sew it at 1/2 inch, fold it over and sew it on the other side. So I'm just finishing off the last strip that I need to join to my long strip before I begin the binding. Here we go. You'll notice I said I'm pressing the binding, not ironing it. That's exactly what you want to do. You just want to press the iron down for a couple of seconds on each section. You don't want to iron it because ironing it moves the fabric around and then you won't get a nice even half fold on your fabric edging. In order to get started, what we're going to do is I'm going to lay my 2 pieces of edging out in the shape of an L. Now we want to make sure that you have right sides together. That way, when you have sewn your miter edge on angle, you open it up, it's going to open up like this. So it's always a good idea to check that you've done that so you don't make a mistake. So again, lay your piece out in L towards you as you look down at it. Right side up here, right side down here, meeting in the corner. Once I've done that, then I'm going to take my ruler and place it the corner at the top edge of the top piece of fabric and the bottom edge. We want to make sure that we have these all lined up nice and neat, so that these come out in a perfect 90-degree angle. So when I lay that in the top corner here on the 90-degree line, it runs straight down the fabric and down to the corner over here. Then I take my marker and mark my line. And I'm just going to place 3 pins, 1 in the center, 1 in the top, 1 in the bottom, to hold it in place as I'm sewing. When I bring the piece over to my machine, I'm going to take that L, take the bottom corner and turn it so it is pointing like an arrow straight out to the right. That's going to make sure all the excess fabric over here doesn't get caught up in the throat of my machine, and it makes it really easy to sew the 2 pieces together. Have it all laid nice and flat. Just sewing on a straight stitch starting from just off and run it along that line. You'll notice I didn't back stitch at all. You won't need to do this because this edge is going to be folded in half, then in half again, and sewed down onto the project as the binding. So you're not going to need reinforcement because the edges are not going to be loose, and they won't cause any problems. Next, I'm going to bring the piece back over here. I'm going to grab my cutting square, and I'm just going to leave myself 1/4 inch for my seam allowance. Okay, that's all we ever leave when we're quilting is 1/4 inch on the seam allowance. So I take that 1/4 inch, lay it right down on my sewing line where my threads are, take my cutter, cut off the excess. That one doesn't want to let go. Okay, save the triangles for later. Scrappy quilts. Okay, now I'm going to take this piece over here to my iron. I'm going to lay it down and press those seams to set the stitches. Then I'm going to open it up, and as you can see, it's beautifully mitered, so it joins together, and instead of doing a flat seam, which can come apart much easier with stress and strain of moving and everything using the quilt, this is really going to be very strong because it's on an angle, so the stress is more evenly distributed. Okay, last thing to do is to fold this piece over and press that seam in half. Okay, all done. Right, now the next thing for me to do is to just sit and pin. So again, I'm going to be pinning to the front of my quilt, and when I'm starting off, I'm going to work around the quilt going from right to left in a clockwork pattern. I want to make sure that as I'm starting off somewhere roughly around the midline of my quilt, and I also want to leave about 18 inches of a tail. Okay, this is going to be important for later on when I am joining the two edges together when they meet up the start and the end. And we'll get to that later, but for now I'm just going to take the fabric, 2 raw edges together, that way you know you're sewing it properly. 2 raw edges together, leaving a tail, and I'm just going to start pinning all the way around. Alright, so I'm making it here to my first corner, and I'm just going to show you how I'm going to pin this down so that I get a nice corner seam that comes around and folds nicely, and then it's going to be able to fold over nicely and look really good. So the first thing to do is I want to get close to the corner with my other pins. Hey you guys. And as I come to the corner here, you can see I already have a 1/2 inch seam allowance that I sewed on the quilt. So I'm going to put a pin at that 1/2 inch line because that's where I want to stop. Okay? In order to make it around this corner, I'm now going to take this piece of fabric and I'm going to twist it. Now, I don't want to put that pin all the way through to the other side. It's just going front to back at the moment. I'm going to twist this around to the side and curl the fabric underneath so that this comes to the corner and then lays flat down. Then I'm going to lay this edge here that I'm folding. It wants to lay, or it should lay, at a 90-degree angle. That's going to give me this perfect, I think it's called a mitered edge, I'm not sure, but it gives me a perfect point on my corner. Now I can push my pin all the way through and it's going to go through this layer that's now continuing this way. So this piece just bobbles like this, and that's fine. When it comes to the sewing part of it, I'll show you how we sew this so that it becomes a perfect pointed mitered corner once we flip it over and open it up. We're going to have that same mitered edge look to our corner. Again, just using a straight stitch on my machine, I am going to bring the bulk of the quilt up onto my work surface so that it's easier to feed through my machine. And I'm just going to start at that first pin. Again, I'm leaving a nice long tail for joining the pieces later. And it's also leaving an opening for when I want to join them later. I'm going to feed all the fabric underneath. And again, I'm looking to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if I wasn't sure of what that was, I could take my tape measure and mark it out on my machine from where it was from where the needle goes down to the edge. But you should also be able to see along your foot plate, it has markings, okay? So it does have, you know, like a 3/8 and 5/8 and 7/8. Between 3/8 and 5/8, there's a line that's not marked. That's your 1/2 inch. So that's the one I'm going to be following as I'm sewing on my pieces here. Okay, I'm going to drop my presser foot and begin sewing. I like to hold my quilt at the back just to make sure I'm helping it to go straight through and it doesn't twist and turn on me, thus keeping my 1/2 inch. Okay, so as I'm coming to the end here, remember I showed you that I had my pin in at a 1/2 inch, and then I had folded back, folded under the top to make that corner. Well, right now I just want to lay it flat as I get to that 1/2 inch corner. And if you have the feature on your machine where the needle stays down and in, that's a really nice feature to have, because you can just do a pivot. Or you can come to this 1/2 inch and just sew off the edge of the fabric there at the seam, and then make your folds and come back on, and it's going to give you that perfect mitered edge. Again, I'm not that experienced at doing miter edges and sewing my bindings on, so I like to just run it off the machine at that 1/2 inch where my pin was, and then fold my fabric over and down, and then come back on to the fabric once it's completed. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to sew up to my 1/2 inch, which is there. Now I'm just going to lift my presser foot, and I'm going to sew off. Okay, raise my presser foot. Now what I can do is I can take that pin out. I'm just going to leave the threads there. I'm not going to cut the threads at this point. I'm going to turn that fabric so that it's running down the edge over here, and I've got it folded up enough so that I have my 90-degree angle. Folding it up, what it's going to do is it's going to pull that back fabric up and out of the way so that you're not sewing it down here and then over top, okay? Because we don't want to do that, because then we won't be able to turn it over after if we've sewed it down. That's why you want to pull it up and out of the way and laying it down along the 90-degree edge here. Now all I'm going to do is reinsert my fabric inside the sewing machine, but again, to help me know where that 1/2 inch is supposed to be, I'm going to take another pin and I'm going to put it in at the point where that 1/2 inch is supposed to be, so I can make sure I am queued up on that line. So now I just drop my presser foot and start sewing. Again, staying on my 1/2 inch line. Right, so I'm going to continue on with pinning the edge and sewing along and doing my miter edges. It's the same thing all the way around. I'm going to repeat this process 3 more times in each of my corners, and I'm just going to continue sewing and pinning and sewing and pinning as I go along. So I will show you what it looks like once I have the whole binding around the front side of the quilt. We've come to the part where we now have to join the 2 segments of our binding, okay? So this is a little tricky, takes some thinking and doing, but once you get it done, the result is really beautiful. All right, so what you want to do is you're going to lay one of your pieces out, and then you're going to take, you're going to mark the center point of where you're going to cut your pieces off, okay? So I don't want it to happen right here on this seam, so I'm going to take it just back a little bit. So again, getting my marker, which is hiding, and my cutter. And then I'm going to need my cutting square. So I'm going to take this point about here is going to be my halfway. So what I want to do is I want to mark that. And I'm going to lay the other piece across and mark that exact same spot. Okay, so Ooh, purple on purple is hard to see. Okay, so right here. So that's where I want them to meet up. Now, in order to get them to meet up, I need to measure half the width back of what my overall binding is going to be, which is with 3.5, it's going to be 1 3/4 inches back. So 1 3/4 inch back from this line is going to be here. And 1 3/4 this way. Okay, I've got 2 lines. I'm going to do the same thing on this piece. Now, the first 1 3/4 is just to measure to make sure when I'm measuring backwards from the line. 6.5, 5.5. I better measure this the right way around. Okay, is to make sure that I'm going to have marks where my points are going to line up. Now, the first 1 3/4, which goes off the edge of my center mark, that's where I'm actually going to be cutting. So I'm going to just take this off my mat, or sorry, I'm going to just take this binding edge off. I'm going to take my cutting mat, lay it down on the line, and I'm going to cut. Okay, so that's my excess. Then I'm going to take my other binding, and I'm going to cut off at that outside 1 3/4. Now again, purple being difficult to see. Let's just go 1 3/4 that. That is where I thought it was. Okay. Okay, so now those 2 pieces I don't need. Now this is the tricky bit. Because you are working in an opening in such a small space, we have to do that L shape again with these 2 tails. So that's why you want to make sure that you leave the tails long enough that you're able to manipulate all of the fabric in order to make your L shape, and in order to then take it and mark it and sew it. Okay, so I'm going to move it off to the side. Again, I am going with my pieces right sides together. Okay, very important, right sides together. So I'm going to open this tail, trying to get it to stay on the table. Okay, and now the other piece of my L is going to go out that way. So again, right side together. Going to lay this down. My corner to my corner. And when I open it up, I can see that purple line on the top where I measured 1 3/4 back. If I've done my measurements correctly, the edge of this one, when it's laying over, will line up with that line, and in fact it does. So just going to pin this to keep it steady and where I want it while I'm manipulating the other part. It just makes it a little easier. I'm going to take that pin out right away when I go to make my line for my 90 degrees. So again, I'm going to look on this one and see if my 1 3/4 line back matches here, and it does. So I know that I've got the 2 pieces the way I need them. All right. This is always a fiddly bit, don't worry. Lay it down nicely. Again, with my L on here, I'm going to take that 90-degree line that goes through the center of my cutting mat. I'm going to put it up in the corner, running along the edge. And then it's going to come down to the opposite corner. So I'm just not quite on my line. I'm going to just shift that a little bit. And shift my fabric a little bit to make sure that they're absolutely even. Okay, now I'm going to mark my line for where I want to sew. And I'm going to finish pinning. Put that pin back through. Good to go. Now we'll bring it over to the machine. So we're going to do the same thing we did on the other mitered edges. We're going to take this and we're going to bring it to the sewing machine and sew along that line. Again, just double check, make sure all your fabric layers, both of them are nice and flat before you begin. That way there's no unsewing and resewing later on. And you want to make sure that you start the line just a little bit off. Thank you. Run a couple stitches off and we're done. My helper Theo. Hey, helper Theo. What you doing, babes? Remove your pins. Let's cut that little tail off, the little corner. Remember to leave your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Theo, the people can't see. Someone just woke up from his nap and is very snuggly. Now this part can always be a little tricky because you need to get that square ruler in there and it's got to be nice and flat in order to get the correct measurement. So I think what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to lay this on the line here and I'm going to measure a 1/4 inch back using my rule line there. Might be just a little bit easier here. Okay, take this over to the ironing board and press it flat and then press it open and continue sewing. That edge now nicely pressed in half, and you can see how perfectly flat that's going to lie. And now I can just finish sewing up the hole here, joining edge to edge on my 1/2 inch seam allowance, and this is done for the sewing portion. And then I'm ready to begin the hand basting the other side, turning it over. So we'll put this in the machine and just finish it off. Now you can see I didn't pin any of that. I just did it by hand because it was a small enough space that I could get away with it. Also, because we're not doing any back stitching, I did start back probably a half a dozen stitches and went over the previous stitches that were there. Again, that's just going to reinforce this spot here where the edging overlaps between where I started and stopped sewing. But this is all done. So have a look. Doesn't that look beautiful? It's all on there all the way around. Ooh, fluffs in the nose. This fabric's really bad for that. What I do now is I get comfy in front of the couch. I get myself a hand needle and some thread, and I just fold this edge over like that and simply catch the very edge of the fabric on the binding and going through the top layer of the quilt just past this ½ inch sewing line that I have there. So none of that's going to be visible, and this is going to look like it has two really nice rolled flat edges when I'm finished. But the hand sewing part takes a couple of days. Me sitting watching TV, hour here, hour there. I'm not going to bore you by videoing the whole thing, but I will just show you a picture at the end once it's all completed and ready to go in the wash. Now, the reason I want to throw it in the wash is it's going to get rid of all the loose fabric that came about from all the cutting of the rag edge. And it's also going to take the batting layer and this cotton layer, and it's going to ruffle it up, and the edges, because they're loose like this, it's going to make it look aged and worn, and as those shrink and curl, it gives it such a beautiful effect. And it's already been in use, the quilt. Before it had the binding on downstairs, the girls and I have been using it in the movie room to snuggle under while we're watching TV. And it is super comfortable and so nice and warm and toasty. So it's a great snuggly blanket. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. And if you did, please hit the subscribe button down below to see other videos that I have. Make sure to hit share and share this video with friends of yours who might be interested in learning different things, whether it's sewing or scrapbooking or cross-stitching, woodworking, crafting, home improvements. That's what this channel is all about, is doing it myself, for my kids, for my home, to make things more beautiful. And I hope to inspire other women to try their hand at things around the home as well, that'll not only bring you lots of pleasure and a sense of purpose and accomplishment, but will also make your life better. Take care, and thanks for stopping by Handy Mama's Workshop. We'll see you again.